Good afternoon and welcome to the first ecology series talk here this semester. I'm very happy to introduce Beth Rose Middleton, who is currently coming to us, I believe, from Alaska, right? And she is a professor in Native American Studies at UC Davis. And she's also the author of some really intriguing books. She wrote Upstream Trust Lands and Power on Feather River. And this is largely about Indian land rights and hydroelectric development in Northeastern California. If you're interested in those topics, I highly recommend you take a look at this. And another book, Trust in the Land. So I realized that she and I share some research interests. And if you came to my talk last spring, I'm collaborating with a tribe and interested in learning more from people like Beth, who are really thinking through how do we build better relationships between Native communities and land grant institutions. So I'm really interested in that line of your work. And as we know, land grant institutions, the seed funding for a lot of these institutions came from seizing Indigenous land or paying dollars on pennies on the dollar for it. So I think confronting this injustice is a really important thing to do, and in a way that's oriented around healing. So she's also interested in how Indigenous people, I believe in California, used fire management to manage the landscape pre-colonial. And then what are the lessons from that for us now in terms of trying to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic fires? How do we learn from traditional burning practices? And what does that mean for things such as carbon credits? So without further ado, I'm warmly welcome you to our ecology seminar series, and please, we look forward to listening to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to join you all. I wish I could be there in person. I am in Alaska. I just arrived in Dena'ina Homelands in Anchorage this afternoon. I'm here to learn about a very moving and empowering dam removal and river restoration project on the Eklutna River as part of a project with the Open Rivers Fund. But let me go ahead and share screen and start a slideshow. Okay, so I'm really glad you mentioned the relationship between land grant, or sometimes called land grab, institutions and tribes. And I have here our land acknowledgement at UC Davis, which has been established working with Kachildihi, Yochidihi, and Quetzaldihi Wintu nations. And we are within their homeland, in Patwin homelands. And so I'll read it and then I'll say a few things about it, because it's very relevant to what I'll be talking about with you today. So we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachildihi Band of Wintun Indians of Calusa, Quetzaldihi Wintu Nation, and Yochidihi Wintu Nation. Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. I think the land acknowledgement is very much a beginning. It's very much about improving the recognition, building the relationships between universities and the tribes whose homelands they have been established within. And then the question that always confronts me is, what's next? Where do we go from here to really go beyond words to actions? And this image here is actually within Patwin homelands, and it's on one of the reserves. And you can see that there's some shrubs, and it's kind of a, typical for the habitat here. But I think perhaps to the eye of someone who knows about traditional land stewardship, they might look at this and say that fire might be needed here, and not catastrophic fire, but a low intensity cultural burn to restore this landscape. So what are ways to make it possible for people to be able to tend their homelands that the university is now situated within? And are there opportunities for partnerships and collaborations that might be generated by the parties working together? So these are just some thoughts to begin with. So today I'll be talking a little more theoretically, but a lot of examples. And then tomorrow's talk is a little more policy. So this is called Towards a Decolonizing Political Ecology. What does that mean? And I'll explain the context of this picture as we go forward. So first is kind of shifting perception of the Americas, in particular as diverse indigenous homelands, as an international landscape of different indigenous nations, and one that has been impacted by and has resisted colonization. So a political ecology approach, as you may know, is an innovation in geography and anthropology and environmental policy, other fields, about avoiding simplistic explanations of environmental change, disaster, climate change, various environmental issues, especially explanations that blame specific populations for degradation. Some of the early political ecology looked at blaming local people for soil decline in soil quality, soil erosion, loss of topsoil I believe it was in Africa. And so a political ecology approach looks much more deeply at many different aspects to try to understand why the quality of the environment is changing, why the climate is changing, rather than blaming a local population in particular. Political ecology also seeks to acknowledge power in ecological systems, that the way we relate to non-human beings, to the natural world, to ecology, is often implicated in power relations. Political ecology endeavors to examine the causes, the complex interlocking causes of environmental issues rather than just the symptoms or the outcome. And it looks back in time, contemplates the present and even the future, and across different landscapes as they might relate to each other, to explain those configurations of power that frame human environmental relations, as well as human relations that are rooted in racism, classism, citizenship issues, and gender. So those kind of axes of human relationship, how those influence relationship to non-humans, to the environment, to place. So political ecology has some of the following antecedents. Some of you may be very familiar with this already, but there's a history of engagement with Marxist political economic analysis, in which the state or corporations take the resources and make people who are dependent on the local environment for subsistence beholden to those who have now seized control of that environment. There's also a stream from environmental anthropology, looking at human and ecological systems and their relationship to each other. Are they self-regulating, mutually constitutive, and how power dynamics mediate those relationships? World systems theory is one that resonates a little more with me, and this idea that there's a core or a hub where often economic assets are concentrated, and then there are peripheral sites, and that structures global inequality and sort of the whole structure of colonialism, of seizing and drawing resources from one place to another, the sort of metropole argument. And this is related to the development of underdevelopment, that certain areas that are suffering economically, socially, that they have been underdeveloped by the seizure of their assets to benefit others elsewhere. So some of the questions people ask are, is it race? And if you think about the coloniality of power, which involves the structures of colonialism still being in place, the hierarchies of race and class and ethnicity still being in place even after the colonial power is removed. So is it race or is it class that's key to understanding dispossession and how humans contribute to environmental catastrophe? I ask, what about histories of colonialism as they continue in the present? That's the coloniality, and intergenerational trauma, which will take us to healing in a moment. And further, what about non-European derived perspectives on environment and human relationships or responsibilities to places. As you'll see, these three here generally focus on more European-derived analyses. That's not necessarily the case for coloniality of power, which really has a strong heritage in Latin American scholars and scholarship. But it's not necessarily indigenous perspectives on responsibility and relationship to place. So being in Native American studies, working with tribes, always learning as I'm working with people, kind of made me question even this forward-thinking realm of geography or environmental studies that is political ecology. So when we think more through an indigenous studies lens, we think about decolonization and how we unsettle settler colonialism. Settler colonialism being most simply settlers came and didn't leave. It wasn't that there was a colony elsewhere where natural resources were taken and brought to the country that the colonizers came from. It was the relocation of colonizers to a new space, to an indigenous space, lack of recognition of indigenous people there, and the seizure of that land and trying to make it like the old place. So settler colonialism is not just those actions, it's a whole framework, a whole way of thinking in which history starts when the colonizer arrives. So how do we unsettle that? One of my favorite texts that I use in teaching is William Bauer's California Through Native Eyes. He's a scholar at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And he does a wonderful job of putting settler narratives of California history, which are kind of the mainstream you get in fourth grade about the gold rush and the development of the state, alongside indigenous histories of how people came to be, how California came to be formed, what relationships were put in place, and puts those in conversation in a way that unsettles what is the accepted truth of settler histories. Decolonizing addresses the erasure of indigenous histories, ways of knowing, ways of relating to place, names for places, and laws of behavior in certain places and with other beings. And it also addresses the naturalization of settlers as, for example, having always been there or having a divine right to be in a place. And that brings us to the question of incommensurability versus reconciliation. And I know I'm kind of talking at a high level right now, but when I get into these examples, I think it'll all make sense. Sorry about the spelling error there. Two I's shouldn't be an incommensurability, but incommensurability as to when you realize that the settler history is false and also just one story of relationship to a landscape and not the only story, that there's an incommensurability. What do you do then? It's hard to reconcile and create a space for both worldviews. This is a quote from Tuck and Yang, Decolonization is not a metaphor. They say decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve repatriation of land, simultaneous to the recognition of how land and relations to land have always already been differentially understood and enacted. So if we bring this decolonization aspect to political ecology, these are some of the elements I've sketched out as approaches to indigenous political ecology, and really want to give a shout out and recognition to colleagues like Clint Carroll and others that I have learned with and from in developing some of this framework. So addressing coloniality, the ways in which colonial relationships, thoughts, and structures set in place during the colonial encounter and expansion are perpetuated in the present with the naturalization of certain ways of doing things, certain structures of land management. Foregrounding indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge of places as very practical place-based knowledge. Recognizing and supporting indigenous governance, self-determination. There's some powerful work happening in the Native Nations Institute, for example, at University of Arizona. Decolonization, undoing colonial thought, relationships, and structures, much easier said than done. So let me now go into how we apply these concepts and think about healing. So thank you for that wonderful introduction and for bringing up the concept of healing. And I'll ask you all to consider what's at stake in context of ongoing political, cultural, and environmental violence. So the action of seizing of land, enclosing it, whether it's for conservation or development, involves exclusion of Indigenous peoples. If people have not received title to that land again, there's an ongoing situation of violence on multiple levels. So what does healing look like in this context? And also, how do we reframe the context to better understand what the situation in which we're working? And how do we then move toward context for land return and policies that enable that? And I'll talk more about that tomorrow, but I'll just start with it today. So I'll focus a bit on California, but these perspectives can be applied in other places. So on the left is a map showing the international context of California, many different indigenous nations. And then on the right is a map showing, after the encroachment of settlers, the founding of the state of California, the non-ratification of the treaties, the very limited recognition of indigenous homelands. There are a few larger land bases, Hoopa, Yurok, Grand Valley, Tule River, some down south, but many of the recognized lands recognized as under federally recognized tribal jurisdiction are very small, making it very difficult for people to take care of their homelands. So I will start with an example of some collaboration up north. On the map on the left is a map of Yurok tribe ancestral homelands. On the map on the right is the map of the recognized Yurok reservation, which runs on both sides of the Klamath River from Requa to Witchpeck, where the Klamath meets the Trinity River. And I've been really privileged to work with the Yurok tribe on a couple of different projects for about the last 6 years or so, maybe a few more. So even the boundaries within the recognized Yurok reservation are not all under the jurisdiction of the tribe due to a colonial history, exploitation of the Timber and Stone Acts, which enabled the early timber companies to acquire lands within reservation boundaries. So a good portion of the reservation is not under the jurisdiction of the tribe. Also within the tribe's homeland and central to the tribe is the Klamath River. And within their homeland, there's been extensive manipulation of the Klamath River, a story similar to that on other rivers throughout the West and throughout the United States. And even though tribes downstream, Yurok and Karuk, have recognized rights to the river, it's recognized that it's central to them, to their lifeway, to their subsistence, to their identity. And that should be the senior right because they were the first there. Even in that context, the Bureau of Reclamation established the Klamath Project upstream. So now you have competing claims to the water because there is a federal reclamation project upstream that supports agriculture in the upper part of the Klamath Basin. So there are multiple dams on the Klamath. And if you've seen the film River of Renewal, you can get a sense of some of the history and some of the intense conflicts over water in this basin. And in 2002, despite the ruling that water was needed to stay in the river for the fish, irrigators upstream turned on the water to irrigate fields there. And you can see some of the conflict in the film. And it caused just a huge catastrophe on the Klamath downstream, incredibly painful. Just large amounts, thousands of salmon died due to the warm water temperatures and less water in the system. I will say though, and I kind of am giving you this context to think about the Indigenous political ecology framework. So we have a situation here in which the river is essentially pulled in two different directions, at least two, actually hydropower is a third, irrigation, hydropower, and tribal rights and relationships to the water. And from an Indigenous political ecology perspective, one might ask, look deeply at the history as to how this came to be, the colonialism, the incursions on tribal lands along the Klamath, the damming of the river without tribal consent, and all of the impacts up and down the watershed to the ecology, as well as to the people. So on a positive note, after many years of struggle, these 4 dams will be removed. This is from the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. And the date is shifting, but hopefully within the next year or so. This was the last salmon festival I was able to go to when they were able to have it before the pandemic. And I just show this graphic to show their graphic here, which shows the dam coming down, the salmon. It's very hopeful. In addition, and I'll talk a little bit more about the context for how this can occur tomorrow when I talk more about policy. But the Yurok tribe has been engaged in generating carbon offsets, establishing carbon sequestration projects. And they have been able to leverage the funds from carbon offsets to purchase lands within their homeland. So they're using this legal policy tool, the market in California for offsets established by the Air Resources Board, to buy back lands within their homelands that were taken by settlers and timber companies around the turn of the century. So it's, on the one hand, I think extremely innovative and powerful. This particular type of land management fit with the tribe's goals. They develop multiple partnerships. It's an incredible series of projects. And at the same time, it's also frustrating that they need to raise the funds to buy back their homelands. So I kind of put that there for you. And one of my former students, who's now a professor at Humboldt State University, Dr. Caitlin Reed, she and I wrote an article about the tribe's carbon offset projects that was in Stanford Environmental Law Review that I can send if people are interested. So you can see some quotes here, just the moving process of bringing that land back into Yurok jurisdiction from a politically recognized point of view. So just powerful. And this is a picture of, they offered rides in traditionally made canoes, and that's my son at the front there, on the day when we went to the celebration of this land transfer. So I'll shift now over to Northeastern California, and then beginning again from unsettling the settler narratives. This is an area, in Northeastern California known for its mining history, gold rush history. This is in Plumas County, intensive timber history, recreation. When I first started doing research on some of the histories of tribal lands, I was told that the power company had always held these lands. It was a lot of historical amnesia in the broader population, certainly not in the Maidu community. That's where I learned about the history of these lands. This is a map created by Honey Lake Maidu, and it shows world makers' journey through the landscape. And there are stops along this way that you can see when you're driving through the landscape, certain rock formations, and each one is part of the history of world makers movement and making the world safe for humans. So it's a shift in thinking about this place as a Maidu place from Maidu perspectives rather than settler perspectives or even political jurisdiction, Forest Service and other entities that now oversee the land management of much of Maidu homeland. So this is important, and I'm drawing on Willie Bauer here, Dr. Bauer in California Through Native Eyes, but he talks about the importance of creation narratives and what they do. They talk about specific people in specific places. They recognize that specificity. They define governance, territory, relationships between people. They defy colonialism. I like this quote here. They counter settler histories and laws with an indigenousness that began at creation. California was not created in 1769 or 1849. It is ancient, and California Indian people insist that creators made land specifically for them, defying this broader notion of terra nullius, or empty land, that colonists asserted. And they also provide guidance on how to behave and lessons about dealing with oppression and changing legal conditions. And so I often ask people to think about, when you are able to listen to or learn or read these narratives in a place and see the places that are discussed in the landscape and think about how things have changed over time, whose jurisdiction is involved, what's the condition of the land and the ecology and the human community in relationship to the ecology. How do these narratives impact understandings of time and the passage of time, that place and its history and identity? So these are those elements. Again, I bring them up to remind us about addressing coloniality, foregrounding Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding a place, recognizing Indigenous governance, such as that exercised by the Yurok tribe to engage in the carbon offset market, and decolonization. So back in Mountain Maidu country in northeastern California, this is Tasmamkoyam, or Humbug Valley. Place salmon used to come all the way up to, no longer are able to due to a series of dams that I'll talk about in a moment. A lot of culturally important plants here, like this elderberry. Very important place for weaving materials, for medicines there and nearby. And this is one meadow that was not flooded by hydroelectric development around the turn of the century. Several other high mountain meadows in this region were. In fact, this region became the headwaters of the State Water Project, which at the time that it was development was the world's largest system. So it's this area right up here before the largest dam on the project, which is at Oroville Dam. So what I began looking at working with the Maidu Cultural and Development Group was the history of these scattered parcels, Indian allotments on the public domain. So after the non-ratification of treaties, there was no land in this region that was recognized as Maidu land or under Maidu jurisdiction, a place where Maidu people could be without fear of settlers coming on and claiming it as their land, which happened in many instances. So this was a snapshot. So all of this is Maidu homeland, but this was a snapshot of government recognition of individual parcels of allotments on the so-called public domain, what came to be called the public domain. So as you can see, many of them are clustered around Lake Almanor, Butt Lake, Mountain Meadows, and these areas were flooded for hydroelectric development, and some of these lands were flooded. So even the lands that were set aside for people ended up being flooded and seized. So we wanted to look into this and how this happened. And this is one of the examples of what we found. This is a Indian allotment application for a man at Big Meadows, which is now Lake Almanor. And you can see some coordinates are crossed out, and it was patented to the power company. This is downstream of there. This is at Oroville Dam, huge earthen fill dam. Salmon don't get past this point. This is some of the heritage of the dam building. Oroville Dam came later, but there is a series of dams developed, including at Lake Almanor and then in the Feather River Canyon, that generated power for a private company, which helped to power the city of San Francisco. But one of the things I found in the archives was that the demand for power was cultivated. People were encouraged to electrify, get appliances. It was around the turn of the century, the early 19 teens. And so a private company really benefited from the seizure and sale of indigenous lands without restitution to local people. This is some of the construction of the dam. And this is the resulting Lake Almanor, and that's Comyumanim or Mount Lassen in the background. And this was once a meadow crossed by the North Fork Feather River. And this again is Tasmamkoyam or Humbug Valley, a nearby valley just about 9 miles away. This one was not flooded, but it was owned by a power company. And when PG&E had to divest some of its holdings that were non-essential for power production after bankruptcy, and PG&E, I'm sorry, being Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the major utilities, when it needed to divest its holdings or put them into environmental ownership after bankruptcy around 2001, This was one of the lands that was available. It was owned by the power company, but had never been developed. And so I continued this research with community members, looking at the history of these allotments, what happened to them, how they were flooded, whether or not we could tell if people ever got any restitution or any land after the seizure of this brief instance of recognized tribal land. So that, some of it came together, some of the research came together in this text, but there's also an interactive map that's for community members to click on these parcels and get some of the archival information about what happened to those lands. So I hope that contributed to the eventual decision by the Stewardship Council to transfer the land to the Maidu Summit Consortium. And this is a picture from the board meeting at which that decision was made, a great celebration. This is more recent activities. This is a couple of years ago with some of my students collaborating with the UC Davis Arboretum. We got one of our students and learned to gather seed out there, working with Maidu Summit members, including elderberry and other culturally important plants. She also did this with other nations as well, and then grew them out in our arboretum. And then we made several trips to plant them there on site. And this work continues as a way to have a respectful contribution and long-term relationship contribute to the Maidu Summit-led work to restore this place. Recently, the Dixie Fire came through here just last month, so we're waiting to hear how the young plants fared. Let's see how much. Okay, so I wanted to briefly mention land trusts. I don't want to talk too long about this, but that's, thank you for mentioning my book. This work is really about creative uses of environmental law and policy towards Indigenous goals, towards broader goals of decolonizing, what are accepted ways of approaching land stewardship and environmental policy. And so I looked at land trusts, private conservation entities, nonprofits, and how they might be utilized by tribes. And this is one very unique example. This is the Sogoreate Land Trust in East Oakland. So an urban Indigenous women's-led land trust facilitating real decolonial engagement in a very heavily colonized space, a very urban space of Oakland and the East Bay. They see themselves as creating opportunity for people to work together to re-envision what it means to live within Ohlone homelands, again, unsettling the history of this place to understand it as an Indigenous place, calling on all to heal from legacies of colonialism, remember different ways of living. They're very involved in resilience projects to create spaces of resilience and survival as climate change and other factors impact the urban Bay Area. These are two wonderful founders, Janella LaRose on the left, Karina Gould on the right. I have much admiration for these incredible women. And they are talking about doing community organizing, realizing that it was about land. Land was taken, and that was a deep soul wound impacting people in many ways. And so the land trust became a vehicle for reacquiring land, for establishing relationship to place, for doing restoration, for creating sites of resilience. They also do a lot of site protection, again, raising awareness, layers of colonial history on urban spaces in the East Bay. This is near UC Berkeley on the corner of University and I-80, and there's a paved area that covers a historical cultural site, a shell mound. Threatened for development, Sogoreate Land Trust, Indian people organizing for change, many different collaborators have been fighting to protect this place. And part of it is changing the narrative about what this place is and what it can be. Could it be, and I didn't include here one of the artistic renderings, but could it be our site of restoration, putting in native plants, bringing back the natural channel of the creek, rather than a parking lot or a high-rise development? And so again, here thinking about the land trust for cultural easements, protecting sacred places, and asserting being original caretakers of land. And they've done some really, really positive work and really uniting work. So thinking about things from an Indigenous political ecology perspective, these are some questions I try to make sure I'm always asking and really thinking critically about. So when you're looking at a particular issue, maybe it's a river system that's degraded, maybe it's soils that are degraded? What are the key issues and who are the players? What are the relationships to one another over time? How do you understand the issue? What questions do you ask from a political ecology approach, which might deal with political economy, who's making revenue from the system, who's putting funds or labor into the system? What are the power dynamics between those groups? What's the ecology of the landscape, and how does that structure the political economy? So those might be political ecology sorts of questions. How will those questions differ from an indigenous approach? Whose homelands are these within? Are they involved in the stewardship? Could they be? What's the history there? What is their history in relationship to the other players on site? What's their relationship or responsibility to this landscape? And is that incommensurable with the existing political economy of caring for this place? Further, how does taking a decolonizing perspective, really questioning and unsettling settler history and perspectives, how does that impact one's understanding of an issue? And then people always are interested in how they can be supportive. And there are many resources out there about allyship, but I think asking these questions is a good start. So I'll leave you with a couple quotes and then some thoughts about where to go forward. So this is a quote from my friend Farrell Cunningham Yatam, who was one of the founders of the Maidu Summit and wrote the first land management plan for Tasman Koyam or Humbug Valley. And he said, with these lands, we have an opportunity to begin righting a great wrong. We may be frightened of outcomes we are unsure of, but we should be even more frightened of living in a world where the foundation of injustice is honorable and the perpetuation of that injustice is acceptable. We must make a future of justice. I love this quote. It always makes me think about, what are the relationships in place that have enabled the ongoing occupation of this land or certain management prescriptions of this place? How does that fit with colonial history and the relationships that are in place now to this day? Are people still landless within their homeland? And then where do we go from there? Where do we find common ground if that's possible? And then to turn to Tuck and Yang again, decolonization offers a different perspective to human rights and civil rights based approaches to justice, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonization is not an and, it's an elsewhere. There's a lot to think about in that quote, what that looks like, especially if you were to apply it to a particular land stewardship or land management prescription. And then finally, from Native Hawaiian scholar, an epistemology of spirit encourages us all to be of service. In that way, our research is bound in meaning and inspired by service to others or to our natural environment. See your work as a sacred object for your family, your community, your people, because it is. Where we put our time and energy is so meaningful. And may it be towards that future of justice and building more communication and addressing these entrenched historic inequalities. So some ways forward. Political ecology is an expanding perspective, right? It's relatively new in geography. I don't know, maybe 30 years old. Indigenous political ecology, though, goes a step further and unsettles even radical interdisciplinary frameworks to disrupt what are really embedded, accepted colonial perspectives. So not only questioning the history of the land and the context, but how we even know how we relate to the place and to each other and exist in right relationship in that space. So I remind us from thinking about the narratives that we exist within storied landscapes. We may not know those stories, but they embody and reflect non-settler histories of places and peoples. Decolonization, looking straight on at colonial history and the relationships that are still in place, is multifaceted. It's hard. We don't know exactly where it's going all the time. It's complex, it's unsettling, and it's necessary so that we don't continue in this relationship of injustice. Indigenous movements disrupt settler narratives of place and authority, and there's a role for allyship. And one way people can be allies, I think, is by supporting and participating in land transfers, restoration, land and water restoration. Some of the tools that can be used include easements, but certainly not limited to easements, and co-management, co-stewardship. So what does that look like when we think about the context in which even the university sits or an agency sits? How do we engage, going beyond, to return to where I started, going beyond acknowledgement? What does that look like? So I will stop there, which leaves us about 10 or 15 minutes for questions.